Okay, we now welcome onto the show David Limbrick, MP, Victorian politician. Welcome to the show from the Liberal Democratic Party.
Hi.
All right, so we want to talk to you because Victoria is the centre of the free speech debate right now with Fiona Patten's proposed bill and whether or not Labor are going to join in on that. And you were on the Friday show with Rita Panahy, another friend of the show, last week debating it. So we want to talk about that and a whole lot of things. But first off, what happened with Fiona Patten? Because that was a big libertarian hope when she was the head of the sex party, and it was oh wow, all these things like the Overton windows being shifted, and then now she's attached herself to this bill.
She used to be cool.
Well, I still think she's cool in some ways.
David's an ask.
Look, I get along fine with Fiona, and I have a lot of respect for a lot of the things that she's done. But I mean, this particular bill sort of just came out of nowhere from our point of view, and I was a bit surprised, to be honest. I didn't really see it coming. So, but I mean, look, she's done a lot of good work in drug law reform. Obviously, there's a bunch of issues where we don't agree on things, but I mean, it's like if you're a libertarian, you can agree with everyone on something and you disagree with everyone on something too. So and it just so happens that there's a bunch of issues where there's overlap. But I think this bill was a good test of where the differentiation lies, and we had no choice but to come out hard against this because free speech is like our thing, right? We're not going to stand and just let new encroachments. I probably don't even like the term free speech. I think it gets confused a lot. I sort of tend to talk about government controls on speech because people regulate speech all the time, right? Through Twitter and stuff like that. You can ban someone, you can block them, you can kick them out of your group or whatever, and people say, "Oh, that's my free speech." Yeah. But I mean, what we're really talking about is government controls on speech, and in the private realm, people can happily control their speech and control who they interact with and things like that. And sometimes that gets out of control. And I think that's what this bill was trying to address. And so, there's been a lot of cases and they're awful, right? So I say up front, I don't like some of these cases, the vilification that's happened. But from my point of view, it's really, does this legislation really help that or not? And obviously, I don't think it helps it. I think it makes it worse in lots of ways. So, yeah.
I think that's a really important distinction because often people who talk about they don't want government control of speech, opponents say, "Oh, you just want people to be able to say whatever they want, no matter how bad it is." It's like, no, it's just that the people who should be deciding what acceptable speech is the community.
Yeah, I mean, it's the typical comeback that, someone says, "Oh, well, what do you want to say that you can't say now," right? And, I don't want to say mean things to people, and I don't like it when people say mean things to people, especially when they're, pretty disgusting things about, people's gender or race and things like that. But does government setting these standards actually result in a civil society that's more civilized, right? I don't think so at all. I mean, you could take the ultimate extreme. You say, well, government sets out everything that is and isn't acceptable, and we've seen in history governments have tried that before, and it ends very badly. So, I think if you give people the ability to say what they want, then you can end up with interactions and mechanisms to control those interactions. On the internet, you can do that through. There's lots of mechanisms to do that. You can block people. You can choose not to associate with them. There's lots of different ways that you can do that. And I'm sure you guys probably get lots of hate speech directed at you.
I was ready to feel them this morning, actually.
Yeah, I'm sure you get lots.
My friend sent them to me.
So what I was going to say is Fiona Patten's bill seems even a bit scarier than that because it's not exactly like the government saying this word and this word. It's up to a judge's interpretation of what's been said, and the judge is just one person.
Well, it's the way it would work is it's through. So the threshold being set through this bill is, and through the existing Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, is through incitement of vilification or incitement of severe ridicule. Now, the current test is there needs to be some sort of intent of incitement, right? Under this new proposal, that test is removed and it's the result of incitement. So whether incitement actually happened, irrespective of whether you intended to incite severe ridicule or not. And it also extends the number of protected classes. So, at the moment it's just race and race and religion, and it's extending it to, sex, gender, sexual identity, a whole bunch of other disability, a whole bunch of other attributes. Now, the problem with this that I see, which I think is a really big problem, is that because intent isn't tested, you end up with this situation where someone makes a comment which may be gendered or whatever on Twitter, right? And the way that Twitter and all these platforms work is people pile in. So if there's a pile in where people start ridiculing someone based on an original comment, then I think it's quite arguably true that the outcome of that was that severe ridicule was incited. And so the way it would work is they would go to VCAT, so it wouldn't be a judge initially, it'd go through VCAT. The bill also gives new powers to VCAT to produce documents. So they, again on Twitter and these platforms, you don't often know who the actual person is, right? It's just some pseudonym. Mm-hmm. And so they would force the platforms somehow to hand over the documents, and then I suppose they figure out whether they're actually under this jurisdiction, whether they can even do anything about it. And so, there's a whole bunch of things. So I think lowering the bar, extending the protected classes, and the production of documents, these are all clear extensions of government power into the speech realm, and that's why we opposed it. We drew a line in the sand and said, no way, we're going to support this.
And that incitement element, incitement can be orchestrated, can't it? It's not just something that might just happen on Twitter, which you see all the time. It's something you could actually orchestrate. If we can incite something here and do it through, people can have more than one account, then you can actually organise for someone to be caught under these laws if you were motivated enough.
Maybe. And some of the scenarios that... so the law... The law as it stands, my understanding is that it actually excludes private communications, right? So it's only public communication. So where you get these private messages through platforms to someone that are really nasty, they're not covered. But if they make threats or whatever, then they're already covered by federal law. So if you threaten to hurt someone, it's covered by federal laws to make a threat via a carriage service. But think of some of these situations, like people like Clementine Ford, right? She and lots of other people do this. They regularly get nasty private communications, and one of the ways that they deal with that is they post it. They say, "Here's this clown. Look at him. What he's done." Right now, arguably under this, if you posted that and used their gender, so if she was going to deal with some nasty person who was saying nasty things to her privately, she posted that publicly and said, "Look at this little man," or something like that, right? Yep. She's clearly using gender, clearly inciting severe ridicule. I mean, could he claim against her under this? I mean, it's clearly not the intent of the law, but there's a lot of unintended consequences, these scenarios that you can come up with that I don't think that the people that support this law would actually like those outcomes either. So,
I don't think people supporting this law want to see Clementine Ford go down for it. But Labor have said that they're not supporting it until they get clarification on what the religious freedom bills are from the federal level. So, one, do you reckon Labor's going to support it in the end? And second, what do you think about the religious discrimination changes themselves?
So there's a few things. So one of the things that Labor did do that is good is in the reference to the committee, they said it should look at the interactions between state law and federal law, and it should also look at the existing changes, the changes that the federal government's looking at the moment. So, arguably, it's not even the sort of thing that should be done at a state level. I don't know, if someone from Queensland says something nasty to you in Victoria, how's this really going to work? Are they going to drag them down to Victoria to sit before VCAT? I don't know. I just don't see how it works in practice. And if you look at the history of the way the laws are now, there's only been a very, very small number of cases, and I think there's only been one that's actually gone through. Now, Fiona was saying, well, that sort of proves it's working, and I'm like, well, I don't think we've got rid of racism and religious intolerance, so I'd argue it wouldn't be working. And if the whole point of this is deterrent, people need to know about it, right? You talk to the man on the street, do they actually even know this sort of law exists? I doubt it. And the cases that were stated as justification for this, would those people who initiated those, nasty comments and stuff, would they have known about the law and said, oh, gee, I better not make that comment now because of this law's in place and I might get dragged before VCAT? And, no, I don't think so. Like, I'm pretty doubtful of that. And even the practicality, even if you accept that it's a good thing that these people should get into trouble, once they get before VCAT, what's going to happen, right? They're not going to have money for a start, so they're going to crowdfund it. That's how it works. They're going to go to the newspapers for more publicity, and you're going to end up with this great big culture war situation, right? So you're going to get, the Herald Sun and the Australian going to be supporting this new victim who's been, having their free speech impinged. And then on the other side, you're going to have all these people cheerleading for whoever the defendant, or whoever the complainant is. And then it goes through all the motions, and then in the end they get a fine, and then they crowdfund the fine as well, and the person who's the defendant in it probably becomes some minor celebrity.
Yeah.
That's it. That's if the case actually succeeds. If the case fails, then the whole thing's a farce. I mean,
well, that was the thing with Israel Folau, was that if Rugby Australia just did nothing about it, no one would have seen it. But because they fired him, like literally every person in Australia knows what Israel Folau wrote.
I'd never heard of him before.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't follow rugby, and I didn't know anything about it until all this blew up. And it's a good example, really, of what really happens in these cases. Does this improve the way that people act towards each other? I think it's made it worse. So I don't buy it.
Well, great stuff on leading the charge on that, David. You've been the main person in charge of that, and the LDP in general. Another win for the Liberal Democrats last week was the inquiry into nuclear exploration. Why don't you tell us about that and what that means for energy in Victoria?
Yeah, so a few months ago, it was actually a few months ago that we got it up. So we put together... I put forward a motion for an inquiry into nuclear prohibition. So for those listeners who aren't aware, Victoria has its own special laws prohibiting nuclear activities in Victoria. So there's federal restrictions, there's also lots of state restrictions. And in Victoria, you're not allowed to do exploration, mining, anything to do with the nuclear fuel cycle.
Does someone want to tell the people in the level below us that there's no mining?
Yeah.
Well, noise is coming through.
Yeah, so it's totally outlawed, except for certain situations like nuclear medicine. So, but in that case, we lean on Sydney and the Lucas Heights reactor. But actually, there's a big nuclear medicine industry in Victoria. So, Peter Mac and a few of these other institutes are doing wonderful work with nuclear medicine for diagnostics and curing cancer and all these sorts of things. But so my idea was that it's time we looked at these laws. They were instituted back in the middle of the Cold War in 1983. At the time, there was no real prospect of going forward in the short term with any sort of nuclear industry in Victoria, right? So it was pretty cheap for the government of the day. It was under the Kane government. It was pretty cheap for them to do, right? No jobs are going to be lost. It's not going to affect anything. No one was really talking about things like climate change and clean energy and all that sort of stuff back then. And we had tons and tons and tons of brown coal, right? So it was a really cheap win. They went to the election saying, we're going to prohibit nuclear technology. And so they did it. And there was resistance at the time. And at the time, some of the people in the Liberal Party and the Nationals, even though Liberals ended up voting for it in the end, but they were saying that, what about in the future? Like, things might change and prohibiting this now might cause problems in the future. And then here we are in the future and we've got a completely different situation, right? So people aren't worried about nuclear annihilation through, socialist empire anymore.
I think James still is.
Well, some people still are, but all right, some people still are. But I think young people these days, they're not so. People my age, we grew up in the Cold War, and there was a very real worry that there was going to be this nuclear war, right? And people were very worried about that. But now they've got a new worry. The new worry is climate change. They're worried that the atmosphere is going to get too hot and all that. So the climate's changed there, right?
Good one, David.
Like that.
Just mark that one down.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the lines I was using is the climate's changed on nuclear. But anyway. But then there's other things that have changed too. The technology's changed a lot, right? The types of technologies that we build now and the types of technologies that are just around the corner, like small nuclear reactors, this has all changed as well. Plus, there's extensions of what you can do with nuclear technology. A lot of people don't realise that it's used extensively in medicine, for example. It's also used extensively in industry. But there's also other industries like space exploration, where it's pretty much impossible to launch long-distance probes without using nuclear technology. And so I was like, well, lots of people always complain about, take, for example, the Adani mine, right? People are saying, well, Australia exports all this coal and it's damaging, because they export the coal, people in other countries are burning the coal and creating all this pollution and carbon emissions and stuff. But what no one seems to talk about is the fact that we export massive amounts of uranium. And in the 17-18 financial year, we exported uranium that was equivalent to, if it was used to generate clean energy, which it is used to do so, it's equivalent to 96% of Australia's total electricity production. And so our uranium exports are exporting clean energy of a scale equivalent to if we had 100% renewables in Australia, right? Or even better than that, right? So we're doing a lot that's, helping the environment, I think, through these exports, but nothing is happening in Victoria at all because it's prohibited. And we need to ask questions, is this the right thing to do? Should this? So the inquiry is going to start probably in November, and we'll be accepting submissions. But the gist of the inquiry is looking at the prohibitions and would there be benefits to Victoria of lifting those prohibitions. So looking at environmental benefits, economic benefits, social benefits, and these sort of things. So
Yeah, because we were going to say, there's the student climate strike this Friday, and you talk about all the environmental benefits. So surely we should be seeing a few signs this weekend about the benefits of nuclear power.
Well,
I think so.
Yeah.
Well, I'm actually going to be attending climate strike.
Really?
You're going to take the day off school?
I'm going to take the day off school. So, look, I went to one before. I want to talk to people who are going to these things. From my experience, a lot of these young people are quite open to the idea of nuclear. So the idea that people who are environmentalists are anti-nuclear, I think is changing and is wrong. In fact, the environmental movement globally is sort of splitting. And I think, if you talk to people who are looking at this, they'll say, splitting into two parts, right? You've got what they call the dark green environmentalism and the sort of eco-modernism. And the dark green environmentalism is like, the ones that you would typically associate with this, right? So, the end of the world is coming. We need total economic and social reorganisation, basically state control of everything to do with energy, and humanity needs to pay its penance or we're all going to die sort of thing, right? And that's where that's coming from. And the eco-modernist is, and I'd probably put myself in this camp. There's problems, right? Absolutely, there's problems, but humanity's pretty good at solving problems. We've got lots of technologies that we can use to address these problems, and we don't think that humanity has to suffer extreme poverty and deprivation to solve these problems. And maybe we need to look at removing some of the prohibitions.
All right, David, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, David.